Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and this is the Galloway Farm YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about composting. So composting is just the natural process of organic materials decomposing. The result of the compost is something that can be used in your garden. It's good for just nourishing the soil, nourishing your plants in your garden. It's good for water retention, keeping the soil moist, and it's also just good for keeping things out of the landfill. I know I feel so guilty sometimes about all the kitchen scraps and other things that I put into the trash can that can otherwise be used for composting. So composting is just a great way to keep as much stuff out of the landfills. Composting is also one of the easiest things you can do to take a step towards a more sustainable lifestyle. When Jared and I decided that we wanted to start homesteading, start being more sustainable, living off the land kind of, composting was the very first thing that we decided that we were going to start doing. And this was actually something that we started doing when we still lived in the subdivision that we were in. We just had a plastic trash can on our back porch, and anytime we had kitchen scraps or anything compostable, we would just walk out on the back porch, throw it in, and that was really all. You'd turn it every now and then, but it's so easy. If you're interested in composting but you just haven't started it yet, or you don't really know anything about it, you don't need anything fancy or complicated to get started. You can use, like I said, a plastic trash can. You probably want to drill some tiny holes in it for aeration, or you can just use some wooden pallets, make a little bin out of that. And if you're really interested in it, you can actually buy a tumbler, a compost tumbler that actually rotates itself. It's just what you would prefer using. When you have your compost bin and you're ready to put it in your backyard or wherever you want to use it, you just want to make sure that it's in a place with good drainage so it doesn't get too wet. You also want a place that's out of the sun, partial shade, partial shade and partial sun is good. You just don't want it to be in the sun drying out all day long. And then you also want to keep in mind animals getting into it. So if you're in an area where there's raccoons, possums, or potbelly pig like ours who wants to eat everything you put outside, you just want to keep that in mind. In our compost bin, we have one made out of wooden pallets right now. We lined the inside of it with hardware cloth to prevent as many pests getting in it as possible, and then it also has a lid to it. And if you actually want to see how we built our compost bin, we made a whole video on it, so I'll link that right up here. Okay, so you've got your compost bin, now what? So now you're going to start adding green and brown materials to your compost pile. So brown materials are rich in carbon, and that's what's going to allow air and water to flow through your compost and aerate it. And then green materials are rich in nitrogen, and that's what's going to aid in microbial growth to help everything decompose. So your brown materials are going to be things like twigs, branches, dead leaves, dried up grass clippings, shredded newspaper, shredded paper, nothing glossy. You don't want any glossy paper. You could also do toilet paper rolls, paper towel rolls, all that stuff. And then the green materials are going to be your kitchen scraps, your vegetable scraps, fruit scraps, any animal manure like chicken or duck manure, if you want to add that in there. Green materials can also be things you wouldn't think about, like eggshells, hair, fur, coffee grounds, some just off-the-wall things. You don't want any human waste going in, any dog, cat, or any carnivorous pet waste going in, and you don't want any citrus peels. So although a lot of fruit is okay to go in, you don't want any like lemons or orange peels going in the compost. Now, other things you definitely do not want to compost, that is going to be any dairy products, any grease, oil, fat, anything like that. So that means you don't want to add in any cooked food or any leftover food. If it's been covered in grease or oil, then you don't want to put it in your compost pile. You also don't want any meat, fish, bones, anything like that. Any yard trimmings treated with chemicals. And feel free to put like garden waste in, but nothing that is diseased or pest ridden, so nothing with a bunch of bugs on it. When you're adding in your green and brown materials, you also want to just pay attention to how much of each that you're putting in. You'll hear some people give you different ratios as to how much brown to green materials to put in. I like to do 2 parts brown to 1 part green. Your brown is what's going to be more dry, and then the green will be more wet. If you add too much green materials, then you're going to start to have a wet, soggy pile, and it's also going to smell very bad. If you have an even ratio, then your compost pile is just going to smell earthy and smell like dirt. So some people are kind of eerie on having a compost pile because they think it's going to stink. If you have the right ratio, it will not smell. It's also going to help when you add things to your compost pile if you have them cut up or shredded into smaller pieces. That just helps them decompose faster because of more surface area. So now to get started, the first thing you're going to want to do is layer your brown and green materials, like a lasagna almost. So what you want to start out with is a brown layer. Now this brown layer, you want it to be more bulky items like branches, twigs, pine needles even, just to help air out the bottom and kind of not let it get too soggy at the bottom once you start adding more and more items. So you'll start out with that brown layer, and then on top of that you're going to add your green materials. So that could be anything like vegetable scraps, fruit scraps, or anything like we talked about earlier. Then on top of that, if you want to just add in some animal manure just to give things a kickstart to help it decomposing faster, that will be a great help. And then just remember, you want your compost pile to stay moist. You don't want it too wet and soggy. That would mean you have too much green, and you don't want it to be too dry. If you notice your compost pile is looking a little dry, feel free to lightly water it just to help weten it a little bit. If you see that your compost pile is too wet and it's starting to smell, then just add in more brown material. What I like to add in this case is some shredded cardboard or paper. That seems to soak up all that wetness very quickly. So now you have your brown layer and your green layer, and you're actually just going to keep continuing this process until you either run out of room or reach the top of your compost bin. Now every week to about 10 days you're going to want to rotate or stir the pile, and this helps to just mix everything together, and it helps it decompose more evenly. When your compost pile is ready to use, you'll notice it just looks like dirt. It's going to be very crumbly. You're not going to be able to recognize any materials in it. It's just going to look like potting soil or dirt. When this happens, you can just put it in your garden with your plants. You'll just put the compost around the base of the plants. You can put it in your garden before you plant anything. Just mix it in with your soil. That's going to be great for keeping your soil moist during the gardening season. If there's a drought as well, then it's going to help keep those plants moisturized. Now what I just described to you is called hot composting, and that's just the way that I like to do it. You don't have to do it this way. There is such a thing called cold composting, which is basically not paying as much attention or keeping as much maintenance on your compost pile. So if you're cold composting, you're kind of just throwing things in your compost pile here and there. You're not layering it. You're not keeping that balanced ratio. If you put organic materials in a pile, they're going to decompose eventually. When you're cold composting, it's going to take a while though. It's going to take 1 to 2 years for everything to decompose and be ready to use. The bright side of that, you're not having to make sure the moisture level is right, the ratios are right, and you can just add things in as you please. With hot composting, which is what I described, it takes more maintenance. You're more routine about it. You're making sure those ratios are right. You're making sure your pile is moist at all times. And that will just take a few months until your compost is ready to use, depending on how much compost you have. But the hot composting is much more efficient in my opinion. So that is pretty much all the basics of composting. I may not have even scratched the surface of some things, but that's basically just what you needed to know to get started composting today, right away. So if you found this video helpful, please let me know. Drop a comment below. Tell me what was most helpful for you. And if you did like the video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps us know what kind of content you like. And please subscribe. It really helps our channel. And it also lets us know if you like the content that we're putting out. And we will see you next time. Thanks for watching.